we go through it. And so think about that as starting to try to put on that growth mindset as we're moving through it, especially looking towards how do we come out of this? We want to look for what's the opportunity to come back better or stronger or more comfortable with each other, maybe more human. Maybe we get comfortable with the idea that sometimes on a call, kids are going to run around in the background or interrupt or things like that. And we're not going to hold it against people, right? We're not going to let it be considered super unprofessional. Instead, we're going to realize that we're all human and balancing a lot of things because we've had that view into each other's world now. So some of the key questions to start thinking about the growth for your organization and through your leadership is what's really essential for your organization as it's working through this crisis. Maybe there were pieces that you did that took a lot of time and energy and resources for your team that you're realizing they didn't have a big enough payoff for your clients or for your members, and that really it's not worth continuing. And is there kind of some freedom now to discontinue it because it's maybe just sucking too many resources from your team or from you? And who do you want to rebuild with in the future? One of the really unique things about this is it's kind of changing some of the boundaries of who we can get a hold of or who we can reach out to because the dynamics are so different. And so think about, is there somebody you've been wanting to connect with or wanting to build a partnership with for your organization? And maybe they're a little more accessible right now than they normally would be. So, and what perspectives are missing? Have there been advisors you wanted to have for your organization or people that you'd love to start talking to about joining the board because they have a very different perspective or experience? And can you be reaching out to them or offering support or anything now where it starts to create a relationship that maybe wasn't as strong before? And how can you be creative about how you initiate those relationships in this time? More people are answering their phones, more people are at home, they're a little more accessible. So how can you use that to think about what is the future benefit for your team, for your organization, if you support them now or if you reach out now and start a conversation early?
Okay, so we're going to just revisit the crisis curve, and we're going to do this every week as just a reminder. While we started out talking about innovation and wanted to put that in front of people as sort of the long-term goal for this course and for this process, we recognize that the crisis curve has its own rhythm. And that for us, it's different depending on our organization and what area of the country in. And so we may not be at the point where we're ready for innovation. We may actually be in that emerging reality where we're just sort of figuring out how to get by in the intermediate phase and what that means in terms of leadership. Or we may be in that depression stage, us ourselves personally, or our organizations, and we're actually seeing people blow up. And we can't think about innovation or work with our teams on innovation because conflict is maybe the issue we need to focus on this week. Or it might be something else, like maybe you're feeling fatigued, either burnt out or compassion fatigue, and you just don't have it to think about innovation. And so all the work we're doing during these early weeks are really about building a foundation to help you get to that innovation stage and building, and that foundation is really resiliency. And we're going to be talking about it in lots of different ways over today and then next week. But just want to contextualize that for people. And so in diving sort of into those materials then around resiliency and conflict, and I'm waiting for the slides, here we go. First I want to talk about compassion fatigue. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that when I work in a situation that's crisis, either it's with clients that are in crisis or there's a personal crisis, I've noticed that it seems like the times when I need compassion the most is when I have the least to give. And my work with other organizations and other people have led me to understand that I'm not unique. And I've been very curious about why this is. And there's really two reasons why that happens. The first is the amount of compassion we have for ourselves is directly related. The amount of compassion we have for others is directly related to the compassion we have for ourselves. And so what happens during a crisis as you'll see, is that that little inner critic that we all have in our head. And if you don't have that person in your head, congratulations, I'm so happy for you. You're probably about 1% of the population. But what happens is that inner critic that lives in our head, that sometimes we hear out loud or maybe in our subconscious thoughts, starts to be really super loud during a crisis. Because the thing that sort of keeps them at bay and how we handle them is by accomplishing things, by seeing ourselves as competent, as moving through our day and making a difference, having a sense of mastery or purpose. And during a crisis, what happens is everything we've sort of created to make our lives work, to accomplish things, to get stuff done, to feel good, goes away. And we can control or predict very little. And so as a consequence, that little critic comes up. It is really loud. And we not even be aware of it, but that critic is whispering in our ear and telling us we're failing, we're not doing enough, we're lazy, we're not smart enough to do this, you don't know what you're doing as a leader, and so on and so forth. And so as that critic is raging in subconsciously or consciously in our head, the amount of compassion we feel diminishes. The second reason you may experience compassion fatigue during a crisis is that I see this a lot in actually helping fields, but this is true of many people. We confuse empathy for compassion. And we're going to get into this much more next week and talk about why and how to prevent that and all those things. But just in short, to sort of touch on it today, you know, empathy is really taking on the suffering of others. And when we're in a leadership position in particular during a crisis, and we can't do the things we'd like to do for people, we sort of extend ourselves even more on the emotional side and want to be there for them. And often that means taking on the suffering of them. Whereas compassion, and I'll say that that experience of taking on people's sufferings feels heavy and it depletes us. Whereas compassion is really about helping people, making sure they feel seen, heard, and valued while they're suffering, but not taking on that suffering. And that experience can be actually very rewarding for you. It can give you energy, it can create warmth, it can create a sense of connection and a sense of purpose and value. So those things are really different. And often what you see in organizations in our own lives, we confuse those two things. And so when we put ourselves into crisis, then it's even more predominant. So, you know, that's all well and good, but the question is what to do about it, right? You know, I'm always like, that's great. Tell me what to do so I can do it and I can change it. And so the first thing to really start to replenish those compassion reserves in yourself so that you have more to give and you can really lead with compassion is to really work on understanding the difference between compassion versus empathy and make sure that you're on the compassion side. The second thing is, and this is going to sound silly, and I poo-pooed this for years, I'll be honest, but I found it to be really valuable for me, is to notice that critic and just label it and see it. And the idea is that neurologically something happens in our brains when we see something, we're not actually in it, we're not experiencing it. And that helps gives us distance from that inner critic. And then the third step, or the third thing you could do is if you've had success there, you can actually start to stop that story. And there's a couple things you can do related to that. For people who are really comfortable with these kind of activities, you can stop the story and focus on melting it, dissolving it, you know, changing it however you want. Some people talk about changing it by putting it in a different part of their body. Other people talk about stopping the story and really doing an inventory. For people who are more rationally focused, doing an inventory about what's actually factually happening. What do I know to be true? If somebody were observing me in a lab, what would they write down in their logbook that's actually happening? So depending on your propensity and what's comfortable for you, you can work on you know, working through that story either through, you know, some of the more felt body experiences, is if that's what energizes you, or if you're a more analytical person, you can work on the story by bringing facts to the situation. A couple other things that have been really useful for other people, and I've certainly seen be useful for me, is think about somebody you have compassion for. So Ruth, that might be Eli, right? Somebody who, see, Ruth smiled instantly. you know, and I've seen Ruth with Eli, and I've seen this, and actually Eli elicits this reaction in everybody because he's just contagious. His warmth and love is contagious. So visualizing or thinking about somebody that you have compassion for changes your brain waves automatically, like that, changes it to generate compassion. Or this is a tool I actually use for myself when I feel like I'm failing, or I failed somebody and I don't know why it works. I just have to tell you it works, is I focus on somebody who's less fortunate than me. And because it gets me out of my me story, you know, poor me, I failed, I messed up, I'm not doing enough. And when I start to focus on people who don't have nearly the resources or gifts or tools or that I do, that I've been so fortunate to have, it gets me out of me and focuses on what really matters, and it stops that cycle. And I find that I have more compassion to bring to the situation. So those are just really quick tips. Want to remind people that, of course, you get this PowerPoint, you get this recording, and you get some tools, some quick tools that you can print off and keep at your desk. So if you feel like you're scrambling to pick up on this, don't worry about that. There'll be other opportunities to review it and go back into it.
Yeah. And Lisa, I just wanted to add some of the practices that we've heard too about noticing or labeling that critic a critic that have worked in really consistent applications for people is to either think about the critic as name your critic something else, right? It's not part of yourself. Name them, you know, kind of like the Sasha Fierce for Beyonce, right? Give it a name so it's somebody you can call out that you go, you know what? You're not always right, and you can put a name on them. The other piece is to think about really calling out that story you're telling yourself or how you're beating yourself up about something and say, would I say this to a child in my life I really care about? If there were, or 5-year-old me was standing in front of me, pick a picture you remember from, you know, growing up and say, would I say that to that child? Would I say these same words to that person, that, you know, 5-year-old, 6-year-old who, was in front of me? Because most of us have that reaction of like, oh, my words are pretty mean right now. I'm being really hard on myself about this. And it helps us to realize like we would give others more compassion than we're giving ourselves in that moment. And so it helps to kind of flip it and watch our language a little more carefully and alleviate some of that stress we're putting on ourselves.
Thank you, Christina. So related to this, in thinking about as you are working towards becoming more compassionate or fulfilling those compassion reserves for yourself and others, there's an important clue here when you start to see people react in anger. And remember, we talked about where we are in the crisis curve. And for some people, you'll see them sort of externalize their stress and react more in anger. You might start seeing little blowups among your staff. Things that used to be there sort of under the surface are coming to the surface with a sort of sense of force that is a little perplexing. I know I've had several interactions with people where I've either questioned why they're behaving the way they are or I'm behaving the way I am. And so when you see anger come to the surface, it's always a clue that there's an unmet need going on. And so for you, as you're leading people in working with yourselves and thinking about compassion, one of the ways that you could also bring compassion to the situation is to look at what the unmet need might be. And so there's some basic ones that are really common in a crisis situation that aren't met, that are going to be problematic. So safety. That's really obvious in terms of physical safety, virus exposure, all those things, but also psychological safety, the need for control. Crisis absolutely blows your need for control out of the water. You can control very little. And so this will drive people crazy. Success, we talked about that. You have very little of the tools that you actually relied on to be successful in the past. And so that might, for you or for somebody else, create anger and frustration. Respect, recognition, and valued, all three of those are essential. And I will say that there's something about the nature of crisis that makes you more sensitive to feeling disrespected, unrecognized, or unvalued, and to the degree that it's not even actually happening, but your brain thinks it is. And that's part of that amygdala reaction in the brain that I think most of you, I got a little video on. That part of our brain is meant for survival and protection, so it'll always tell us we're not getting enough. And this is one of the places that shows up. And so when you hear that in your own mind, or you see that in other people, remember that that may not actually be happening, but that's how it feels. There's a term that they use in trauma work called real but not true. Things feel real for people, but they may not be factually correct. You still have to meet people where they are and address those needs, still knowing that it may not actually be what's happening, and help people see that. And then the other is balance. There's absolutely no, as Ruth pointed out, there's no balance in this situation. There's absolutely no balance. And so you're not getting enough sleep. You may not be getting food. You may be going at a pace that makes you unable to even have a sense of what's happening. All of those things can cause anger or even rage in you or in other people. And so while these things are valid, the stressors are valid, the other thing to remember is crisis causes us to react at a level that may not be in sync with what's actually happening. So when you see people blow up over things, while the thing that's actually upsetting them is totally valid, the degree to which they react or you react may need to be examined and sort of evaluated. And I find myself giving myself a pass a lot because I see myself doing all kinds of things. So I'm like, whew, that was like a little severe, or other people. And I think that's one of the things you have to do. And honestly, in our household, we've started just calling that out when we see that behavior and saying like, whew, there we go, a little bit of a crisis trigger there, a crisis reaction. Let's back it up to like what's actually happening here.
I think Lisa also brings up a great point that a lot of times those triggers for somebody else might come across as, you know, disrespectful or devaluing, but often it's actually somebody else really reaching or grasping for some kind of sense of safety or control or mastery, and they don't see that it could come across as disrespectful or that it could come across as valued. They're so stuck in that kind of fight or flight place in the brain that they're grabbing, right? And they don't actually mean it to intend or hurt anyone else, but then it creates this bigger and bigger friction point because now we have multiple unmet needs on both sides. And so kind of slowing down and saying, you know, what was their intention here to grab for, what might feel really uncomfortable to them, can really help reduce those triggers or our own triggers in that moment. Or even recognizing that felt disrespectful. I'm pretty sure they didn't mean it because they were grasping for this. Kind of helps to recenter, rationalize through it a little bit.
And if I could just add, you know, in the vein of like, this is all well and good to understand, but what do we do about it? And we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. But, you know, in the spirit of just in time sort of advice and tools, one of the most simple things you can do in a situation like where you see this kind of reaction, you see anger, is to just ask people, you know, what's going on? Is there an unmet need? Depending on your relationship with that person in the context, you can ask that question in a way that feels respectful. You know, in my household where we use these words, I would ask, you know, are you feeling like you don't have balance? Are you not feeling valued in this conversation? You know, that kind of thing. In a work situation, I don't use those words, but I'll say something like, you know, are you feeling frustrated because you're just not feeling like you're accomplishing something? You know, how can I help you with that? Is there a way I can remove those barriers? But I think that's an important part of leading yourself and leading others, is to recognize when you see those flashes of irritation or anger, is to stop and check in with people and see what's going on. They may not be aware of the unmet needs, but part of our job is to help people look further as leaders. And that's part of doing this work, especially in a crisis, is sort of recognizing what those underlying needs are, even if you can't address them right away. And that's the pain point, I think, and one of the many pain points in leading people through crisis is that we feel like, I'm not gonna even ask because I can't fix it, right? And that's where we go back to compassion versus empathy. Still ask. People can deal with things when they feel seen, heard, and valued. It gives them the tools and their own inner resilience to help address it, even if you can't fix it. Always ask, and ask in a way that's contextually appropriate, using language that obviously that people are comfortable with.
Yeah. One of the ones I found works really well in the workplace is, what feels uncomfortable about this, right? because we know when we're uncomfortable because it's that physical feeling and reaction that's part of that. And so we can name that a little bit easier sometimes than the unmet needs or whatever. We might ask just what feels so uncomfortable so that we can, start a conversation about it. Often helps to just get it moving in the first place.
Okay, and Christina, did we decide we're going to go with one group mastermind?
Yeah, we have a
Okay,
few people who'd like to share so far, so we can handle it with everyone together.
got it.
I'll be stopping the recording as soon as the control comes up.
So I think we said this last week, but this seems to still be the case, that there's just so many people working online. Bandwidth is just sort of slogging. I don't even know the right term, but like moving